Hello, and welcome to the Layers of Accessibility panel, part of the Southern Graphics Conference International Multiple Layers Virtual Conference on March 10th and 11th, 2023. I'd like to start by acknowledging that I'm presenting from Denison University in the homeland of the Hopewell, the Wyandot, Shawnee, Delaware, and other indigenous nations that thousands of years ago, indigenous people made this region a center for trade, culture, innovation in astronomy, geography, mathematics, and engineering. I am Brett Taylor, the chair of this panel, and I'd like to start with a verbal presentation of myself. I am a 6'2", blonde-haired, blue-eyed, white individual wearing a striped sweater, yellow glasses, and blue jeans, and I'm seated in the Denison University print shop. I'm a print-based artist and educator from South Florida, currently based in Columbus, Ohio. I earned my Bachelor's of Fine Arts in Drawing from the University of Florida and my Master of Studio Arts in Printmaking from The Ohio State University. I am currently the visiting professor of printmaking and queer studies at Denison University and lead printmaker at Chautauqua Visual Arts. I consider my practice to be auto-theoretical, exploring the denial and disruption of the binaries through engaging with both personal narrative as a queer, non-binary, differently abled individual, and in conversation with queer and crypt theory to acknowledge that we're all in a constant state of becoming. Employing queer and disability aesthetics, my work challenges static definitions and destabilizes normative constructs that standardize the body's relationship to built space. I was 11 when I was diagnosed with a rare form of bone cancer called adamantinoma. And over the course of 7 years, my right leg was reconstructed 6 times, involving physical and mental rehabilitation. To be othered by illness, I write, is to exist in the in-between. Having the knowledge of the able-bodied, interrupted, overlapped, and overrode by that of disability. Spaces around me changed not because they were reconstructed, but because I was. The failings of my body brought to attention the failings of my surroundings, and this brought to attention the spectrum of ability that one constantly navigates. Thus, my hope for this panel was to invite a productive conversation around the spectrums of ability and access in printmaking, a spectrum that I and many others negotiate daily. The abstract and call for this panel stated that this panel will consider how printmaking practices for artists, researchers, and teachers necessitate transition from traditional studio notions into more accessible and inclusive standards of printmaking. This panel will explore diverse conceptualizations of accessible printmaking through the lenses of printmaking practitioners that have made print more accessible for themselves and others. These adaptations consider an expanse of inclusions and innovations to traditional print practices, exhibition formats, community organizations, resource sharing, and other teaching methods. The artists, printmakers, and educators on this panel explore how to transition conceptual accommodations into more accessible realities of printmaking. This panel includes Kit MacNeil, Becky Spruill, Alexei Lazarev, Kat Chuddy, and Ross Mezapapa. These accessibility leaders and accessibility thought leaders will speak to a breadth of access points to accessibility from personal narrative, accessible pedagogy, technical innovation, open access sharing, and economic and material inclusions. First up, we have Kit MacNeil, a genderqueer artist, curator, and educator, and writer. Their work engages experiences of trauma, mental illness, and chronic pain through an interdisciplinary practice. They have exhibited work in the US, Canada, France, and China, and have been awarded grants from the Ontario Arts Council, Canada Council for the Arts, and the South Carolina Arts Commission. MacNeil earned their MFA from the University of Buffalo and currently works at the College of Printer as the college printer at Massey College at the University of Toronto. For this panel, MacNeil will draw upon their personal experiences encountering inaccessibility in printmaking as someone who lives with disabling chronic illness, and the ways that they have begun to think about printmaking more expansively as they renegotiate their relationship to the craft. Accessibility is not an endpoint for MacNeil. but an ongoing process of negotiating the world and making space for diverse embodied experiences. For that reason, this presentation provides few solutions, but an opportunity to think through and name experience inaccessibility as a community.
Hello, my name is Kit MacNeil, and I'm going to jump right into this. To give myself a quick descriptor, if you can see me in the upper corner, I am white with short brown curly hair, and I am currently wearing a long sleeve black shirt. I want to give a land acknowledgement. I live and work in Toronto, Ontario, on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. This land is also home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaty, signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about my experiences with disability and the inaccessibility that I've found in printmaking studios and processes, and some of the solutions that I've found. To start, this quote reads, "In disability studies, we have the saying that nobody is able-bodied. Everyone is temporarily able-bodied because if you live long enough, you'll become disabled." And this comes from Dr. Eliza Chandler, who's an assistant professor at the Toronto Metropolitan University in disability studies, and is also the founder of Tangled Arts and Disability Gallery in Toronto, which I encourage all of you to look up and find out more. And I am sharing this quote because in regards to my own story, it's helpful to think about it as a before when I was temporarily abled and an after when I became disabled. And that's sort of how I'm structuring this talk. So before, I was very interested in very labor-intensive work and very process-heavy work. And so that's really exemplified by this piece here, which is called Untitled the Void. And so here we're looking at a picture of a gallery. We're looking at the picture of two walls meeting in the corner. And in the corner, we have on the left-hand side, a 10-foot by 7-foot grid of 25 intaglio prints. And on the right-hand side, we have another 10-foot by 7-foot grid of 25 intaglio prints. So all of these prints were pulled from a singular 18 by 24 copper plate, which was aqua tinted, printed, redacted, printed, re-aqua tinted, printed, redacted, printed over and over and over again. I have somewhere between 110 and 120 states in various proofs of this plate, which resulted in the 50 that you see here that kind of create these images. And so the work was very, very labor intensive, not only in just the making of the images and the plates, but also the time that it took. This was about a 6 to 8 month project, during which I spent all of my free time after my 40-hour-a-week job in retail working on. Another piece that explores my excessive interest in physical labor is this performance piece that I did, titled Vicious Cycle. So here we're looking at a screenshot of a dual channel video. And so on the left-hand side, we have a easel with a copper plate that is covered in ink. And on the right-hand side, we have an easel holding a bare copper plate that I am punching with my fists and leaving behind an inky residue. And so this performance piece was very physical in the sense that I actually physically damaged my body to produce it. And so here's a picture of my hand several days after that performance was recorded, in which I have there's ink on my hand, and then there's a significant amount of bruising on my knuckles underneath that ink. And so this is just kind of a couple of examples of the type of work that I was making prior to becoming disabled, whereas very, very, I'll say obsessed really with making almost excessive labor intensive projects. And then a couple of years ago, I started to develop several symptoms. I'm not going to apply diagnoses here, mostly because I don't have any firm diagnoses yet after several years and many doctors. But I am going to talk a little bit about the limitations that I experience as presented by the symptoms. So on the left-hand side, I have my symptoms, and on the right-hand side, I have the limitations. So starting with chronic fatigue as a symptom, it has limited me in the sense that I have to plan out and very carefully conserve my energy throughout the day, or else I will experience what is known as post-exertional malaise, which forces me to limit how much I can do in one day, and also means that I have to maintain a heart rate monitor so as not to exceed a certain heart rate threshold. I experience chronic pain if I am unable to do that, because it's very easy to go past that threshold. And that chronic pain also limits my ability to stand, push, pull, or lift anything over a certain weight. And as a result of chronic pain and chronic fatigue, I have what's known as brain fog, which for me presents as a lot of forgetfulness. I completely blank out on words quite often. So I've had to, as a result of this, I'm really unable to access a lot of traditional printmaking. Stone lithography is completely off the table for me. I cannot do that on my own. Intaglio printing, which I really dearly love, is very difficult for me. And I truly have to, something that I would accomplish over 6 months is, I don't even know, it's going to take me 4 times as long. It's going to take me 2 years or 3 years maybe to complete a project. So I've had to come up with several solutions. And so one of those, I've been delighted. I work as a college printer for a letterpress studio at the University of Toronto. And I'm really delighted to find that letterpress is actually incredibly accessible for me. I have the ability to set type and impose forms sitting down, and I am able to print hundreds, and in this particular case of the image I'm showing here, thousands of prints in a short amount of time on a Vandercook with minimal effort. So on the right-hand side, there's a picture of my work titled, I think my cough drops are gaslighting me, which is I recreated cough drop wrappers using a lino cut and letterpress. I've also found that working with performance and video allows me freedom to explore print very conceptually without very laborious processes involved. And so in this particular image, this is a still from a performance piece that I did at the last SGCI, where I performed at the talent show, and I ate a print that said "Tara, eat this half" on. And the whole thing took me probably about 2 minutes, and the only thing that I suffered was a little bit of stage fright. So performance, check, I can do that. The other aspect that has been a bit of a solution for me is, when you're not able to work in a print studio as frequently as you would like, you lose that very rich and luscious print community. And so honestly, thankfully to the pandemic, I'm able to maintain community and mutual aid through virtual studio groups, virtual art collectives, and virtual collaboration. And so an example of the virtual collective and collaboration that I've been working on is in this picture here. I've been working with Henry Gepfer, who's an artist based in Lancaster, PA, and we have this collaborative group called Fine Print. And so here's an image from a performance that we did at the Mid-America Print Council last fall, where I'm striking Henry across the face, resulting in this picture here, where we can see an imprint of Henry's face that had been coated in makeup. It was white and red in a bullseye pattern, and we can see that imprint and the trace of that performance on this pillowcase. So those were some of my solutions, and I don't have much time, but I do want to close by just encouraging people here to just kind of be aware and to resist ableism in print and art. I'm someone who suffers from what are known as invisible disabilities, where you can't physically see my disability unless I tell you about it. And I guarantee you have students, you have colleagues, you have coworkers who experience invisible disabilities as well. And just to try to learn more about it and make your spaces as accessible as possible. One thing that I've done in particular is embrace what's called a crip time, embrace that it takes me longer to do things than normal abled bodies. And as such, I've stopped dating my work. A lot of galleries only want to see new work. They want work from the past 2 years. Well, let me tell you something. It has been very difficult for me to make new work over the past 2 years. So, and I don't think my work from 4 years ago is necessarily expired. So I'm continuing to submit older works. And I usually put in a note saying, how it is pretty ableist to ask people to only submit work from the past 2 years. It assumes that people have had the time, they've had the resources, they've had the ability to create that work over the past 2 years. And I also would encourage you to continue to explore and invalidate printmaking in the expanded field. To take a note from Linda Knocklin, why have there been no master performance printers? And I will leave it at that. I've hit my time limit. But if you're interested in talking a little bit more about accessibility and printmaking or performance art, please send me an email. You can find my website and Instagram here. We're also interested in increasing accessibility, specifically within SGCI. I encourage you to join our accessibility panel. You can find me at my email address, which is listed here. And you can find out more about fine print at our Instagram and through our email address as well. Thanks so much for listening, and thank you, Brett, for organizing this.
Next up, we have Becky Spruill, who currently works as the Assistant Professor of Creative and Fine Arts at the New Mexico Institution of Mining and Technology. She's the co-founder of the Radical Intersectional Printmakers Guild and the current vice president of the Mid-American Print Council. She has organized and juried multiple exhibitions and panels that work to expand opportunities for historically underfunded and underrepresented artists in the field of printmaking. Her current research includes the intersection of traditional and digital processes, as well as the exploration of socio-historical impacts of the perceptions of the feminine body. For this segment, Spruill will examine the rhetoric of overcoming differences in the classroom and propose an alternative methodology, anticipatory accessibility. Throughout her talk, she will provide a variety of concrete practices that align with the methodology in the studio and classroom, as well as several virtual resources and further readings on the topic.
Hello, and welcome to my section of the Layers of Accessibility panel. My name is Becky Spruill, and I'll be discussing anticipatory course design and printmaking. While I will mostly be discussing course design, as far as like education and specifically university environments, these ideas can also be applied to workshops, gallery openings, and a variety of other educational settings or even work environments. So let's get started. Often when we talk about student accessibility, we tend to frame it in a discussion of overcoming adversity, using phrases like surpassing limitations or pushing through your frustrations, whether those frustrations are realistically something that can be overcome or not, right? They might be physical, mental, emotional, circumstantial, or societal frustrations. For instance, right, when we think about the COVID pandemic, that created frustrations in all of these categories throughout society, and saw a lot of students and teachers having to overcome the adversities of this conditions. Unfortunately, the concept of overcoming or pulling yourself up by the bootstraps, especially in classrooms and classroom environments, is rooted in policies and histories of assimilation, ableism, and white supremacy. As we all likely saw during COVID, if we return to our example, right? Another aspect of overcoming is, or shortcoming of overcoming, is that it doesn't really address a student or teacher's circumstances. Instead, what it does is it burdens both of those groups with additional work, and it requires self-advocacy at every single stage of the learning process, which in and of itself can be exhausting. So let's zoom in a little bit and discuss how overcoming is historically linked to policies of assimilation, white supremacy, and ableism, right? So we'll start with assimilation. Excuse me. Unfortunately, we won't have time to look at the details and nuance of this discussion, but I do urge you to read some of the resources I'll be providing via a kind of packet at the end of this. Generally speaking, I'm providing two examples, so assimilative policies in Native American boarding schools and the use of African American vernacular or Black English in school. Again, there's more on that in the resource packet that I provide at the end of this talk. So essentially, policies of overcoming differences in ability, race, gender, culture, and backgrounds flatten the nuance of student populations, and they reduce their identities to just a student, right? This also contributes to the myth that there's this ideal student who wouldn't have to overcome these nuances, and it forces students with differences to diminish these differences in order to avoid inconveniencing others with their background, with their needs, or even just with their unique lived experiences. So for example, let's say we have a college student who speaks English as a second language and doesn't have any additional tools provided to them. This will likely result in that student having to drop everything to translate any study materials, and that student potentially struggling with new terminology in class environments, right? A lot of that may have something to do with the double burden in this situation, where not only are they translating all the time, but they're also trying to learn. That's double work. And that might slow them down in absorbing information at the speed that they're expected to. Now, I mentioned circumstances where policies of overcoming difference relate to race, right? When I talked about Native American and African or Black American students. Again, these policies come directly from the role that schools have had as an assimilative tool, but they also come from the role that universities have had historically as segregating bodies. Universities and schools in general, as well as galleries and museums, for a long time in the US especially, didn't accept women or people of color. This is a pretty well documented history, so we're not going to go too far in depth with it. But if we acknowledge this history, we must also recognize that while diversity initiatives are often well-intentioned, they do tend to only place students of color or students who identify as women or disabled students into the historical white patriarchal institution. They don't necessarily add any kind of additional support system, right? So they get you there, but they don't really help you integrate into the institution itself, right? This puts undue burden on these student groups to learn hegemonic rules of these historically white institutions. And it also leads these student groups often to feel alienated from the experiences of their primarily white peers. So for example, let's say we have a Black woman who's a graduate student who is disciplined for the perceived tone in her emails. We call that tone policing, when in actuality, she was just trying to be direct. She doesn't understand why her tone is misconstrued, and it's never explained to her, right? If that were to happen, then that person would then have to think to themselves, okay, is there something wrong with me? How do I make sure that people don't misunderstand me and my cultural way of speaking, right? And that kind of perpetuates a small, little insidious branch of white supremacy. And finally, overcoming is also pretty ableist. So students with disabilities or differences in their abilities, physical or otherwise, visible or invisible, are often seen as disabled first and students second. Again, this is a flattening of identity, of their identity, into only two components, right? Components that ignore nuance, right? When it comes to their talent, their skills, their interest, or their dedication. Similar to our example in the last slide, support systems for disabled students are existent, but they're also often quite hierarchical. They're not necessarily social, right? So this means that they have to reach out to staff or administrators, people who are in charge, for support through things like student access services, instead of collaborative environments where they can feel like part of the conversation. So our example here is a student in a wheelchair takes one printmaking class and really likes etching, but when it comes to the screen printing project, they have to have someone else print their screens because the tables aren't adjustable, which then takes their ability to learn away from them. So as an alternative to policies of overcoming, I'd like to introduce anticipatory accessibility. This involves employing accessible measures as part of your course design from inception, so from the beginning, regardless of whether or not students who need those measures are in the room. This model asks that you anticipate your students will be diverse, and they will, and that you prepare accordingly. It also allows you as an instructor to diminish any disadvantage or undue burden upon the student from the first day of class. This terminology is based on phrasings like anticipatory duty or anticipatory action as laid out in the UK's Special Educational Needs Disability Act, SENDA, as laid out in this act and then later in the Equality Act as well. Disadvantages to special needs students must be diminished as much as possible through anticipatory action. Those acts are using proactive language to describe classroom environments that are designed with empathy and with research into the potential needs of a wide variety of students, right? While the language is in these acts specific to special needs students, I believe it's applicable to all forms of accessibility. So you might also be thinking, why bother with anticipatory accessibility in my course design, even when students who may need it aren't actually in the room? This is simple. It's called the curb cut effect. This is coined by Angela Glover Blackwell, and it alludes to how sidewalk ramps, curb cuts, were installed to make communities more accessible to wheelchair users, but they became universal because of the improved safety and ease of movement for all people, right? Essentially, this phrase has since been applied to the probability that any improvement for one section of society often benefits society at large. So examples of this would be elevators, wheelchair ramps, closed captions, and a variety of other things. So we're going to look at what anticipatory action can look like in the classroom, keeping in mind that curb cut effect, right? So we're going to start with presentations and other written course components. My first suggestion is to share your notes and lectures. That assists your non-native speakers of whatever language you're lecturing in. It assists students with attention difficulties, sick students, et cetera, right? That's where you see that curb cut effect happening. Another is that you can check your colors, right? When I say that, I mean there are free color contrast checkers like the one we see here that will help you to see if your contrast ratio follows accessibility guidelines for students with low vision. There are a wide variety of reasons why students will have low vision, and this helps you still reach them, right? There are also free colorblindness checkers and other resources like that. I also suggest allowing them to use their phones when it's appropriate. So for instance, to record your demo for themselves, or to create a transcript using an app like Otter, or honestly, just to take notes, right? This generation types faster than they write. So again, more anticipatory actions in the classroom. So you can allow for things like resubmissions. This method is meant to help them develop good studio practices for when they're revisiting their work in their own independent studios eventually, right? But it's also a second chance. Again, it helps students who are going through unexpected life events, right? Who may need that second chance. Next is recording in the classroom. This is applicable to both lectures and demos. You can use software like Zoom or just your phone to record these. And you can ensure that you're wearing a microphone and using closed captions, right? Or a headset. Zoom will actually create editable closed captions for you if you enable it to, and it will produce a transcript for your students as well. YouTube can also create automatic captions if you upload a video there. Another step is to share the works of artists from a variety of backgrounds. This is our example here. This is Khadija Morley presenting for the CBC Arts on YouTube. This is about representation in the field, right? So a shorthand phrase for this is, if you can't see it, you can't be it. So if students don't see themselves in the field of art or in printmaking, they may not think it's a career path for them. So to counteract this, even if you aren't a member of their community or population, you can share videos or interviews of diverse artists describing what they do in their own words. You can also support diverse visiting artists, bringing them in to develop a sense of mentorship with students that you might have less in common with as their instructor. Now, briefly, I'd like to look at some print-specific anticipatory actions. So the first is physical spaces. Please follow the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Architectural Barriers Act as you develop your space, your studio. The guidelines that they have are openly accessible through the link on this page. I also have them added to that resource packet at the end. So here are two examples of ways that you can kind of use these guidelines as you're laying out a printmaking studio. So the first example is placing acid baths in a reachable, dedicated area with clear space around them of at least 30 to 48 inches, and having those acid baths located no higher than 34 inches off of the floor. These are the same guidelines as sinks for the ADA, right? So you can extrapolate information from that. The second example is modifying your tables and stools to have adjustable legs whenever possible, and having at least one ADA compliant table in the room. Another print-specific strategy is to keep loanable, accessible ways to allow students to print at home. This allows them to keep printing in light of a bunch of different variables in their life, right? So you could, for instance, print 3D mini presses from the Open Press project for students who have trouble with large scale presses, or for pregnant students who can't be in the studio during their pregnancy, right? You can also purchase some rounded brass or glass doorknobs or wooden spoons for students to use as affordable barons, or you could purchase glass barons from Iron Frog, though this option is more expensive. The reason I keep this option on there is it's really helpful for people who can't stand or apply pressure for long periods of time. So they're a really great resource for that. You can also purchase non-textured glass or marble cutting boards, small mirrors, or acrylic sheets for ink slabs on the go. These are relatively affordable, and you can actually often find them in thrift stores, right? Another thing that you can do is have scalable projects. So having alternative projects that teach the same principles, but at a different scale, literally smaller, or using smaller equipment. For example, again, we'll go with a pregnant student. Instead of telling them to drop out, right, or drop out of the class, you can say, well, how about we do kitchen litho for the lithography project? It's much safer for them, it's much more accessible, and they will still be able to participate in the project, right? And then as for materials, something I found really invaluable is creating a studio culture of paying it forward. At the end of the semester, what I do is I encourage students to donate any tools, paper, wood, paint, old copper plates, or other materials that they don't intend to use in the future. And then to make sure that the new students know that this is available the next semester during syllabus day. You'd be amazed how many surplus etching needles, newsprint pads, and things like that I end up with when I do this. So these are just a few of the techniques that I have used and still use in my studio courses with a pretty high degree of success. I'd like to talk a little bit about the citations. These are all citations for the acts that I've referenced in this video. I'm not going to pause too long here because these are also available on the resource sheets that I've made. This is one of those resource sheets that we're seeing kind of scroll through. And these are the links to those resource sheets, which have a number of strategies that I couldn't fit in time, and also quite a bit of websites that you can use as tools and materials that you can purchase and things like that. So please feel free to look at the Google Drive, which has hopefully been disseminated to you in some way. And I hope that this was helpful for you. And I look forward to seeing more accessible classrooms.
Next, Alexey Lazarev, a multidisciplinary visual artist, explores different facets of queer identities and migration, conflicts between personal and collective memories, formation and evolution of hybrid identities, and the emotional side of belonging to a marginalized community. He investigates these themes using personal and found archives consisting of objects, sketches, drawings, and interviews with immigrants, queers, and artists. Fascinated by how century-old methods of image making adapt to the needs of contemporary society, in his project, Alexey examines the interplay between traditional printmaking techniques, woodcut, intaglio, lithography, and new technologies, laser engraving, scanning, and computer-generated graphics. He focuses on the unorthodox application of printed media, alternative ways of editing, the use of 2D prints to create 3D installations, and relief transfers on surfaces such as clay or plaster. Alexey works in figurative style, mixing drawing from imagination with academic renderings, creating a visual language with its own gravity, language, and rules. For this segment in his presentation, Laser Engraving Technology for Accessible Woodcut Projects, Alexey will touch upon how technology of the laser engraving, or laser cutting, can make relief printing more accessible. In particular, he will focus on woodblock printing. He will draw from his own experiences of teaching laser engraving for printmaking at the Altière Circulaire in Montreal in the fall of 2022.
Thank you, Brett, for this introduction. Before I begin my presentation, I would like to acknowledge that I am currently located on unceded Indigenous lands. Tiohtià:ke, Montreal, is historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations. Today, it is home to a diverse population of Indigenous and other peoples. Today, I would like to touch base on how laser engraving technology can contribute to accessibility of print media. I will focus on woodblock print in particular. The technology that goes into today's laser engraving machines started developing in the early 60s. At that time, scientists discovered that they could create a light source, focus its energy, and have a tool powerful enough to engrave a mark on a wide range of materials. Like any other technology, it developed rapidly and became more mainstream just over a decade ago. Nowadays, many universities and fabrication labs are using these machines. The one that you see on the screen is made by Trotec. I think it's like one of the most popular brands. Other brands also exist. However, I've been only working with this one. This technology is used for many different purposes. For example, it may be used to make stamps, to create prototypes, to engrave images on a variety of surfaces, including wood, glass, stone, aluminum, paper, etc. Engraving images is one of the main reasons for using laser engraving for art projects. Currently, I'm showing on the screen several of prints I made a few years ago when I first started using the technology. As an artist, I've been using laser engraving and laser cutting in my projects since 2017. I started during my undergrad at Concordia University in Montreal. It started as an experiment. However, I was very excited to find the tool that allowed me to transfer images very accurately, but at the same time left the space for accidents to happen and also for different types of interventions. Currently, I'm working as a laser engraving coordinator at the Atelier Circulaire in Montreal, and along with other members of the atelier, I work on expanding the use of the machine, and I'm also teaching others how to use it and what possibilities it creates. What you see on the screen at the moment is a print media installation that I've completed a couple of years ago, and all the prints were made using laser engraved wood blocks with different types of interventions on them. To operate, the laser engraving machine needs to be connected to a computer. An image is sent to the machine the same way it would have been sent to a printer. Working with a graphics software like Photoshop or Illustrator, a raster or vector image is transferred on the material. There is virtually no limitation to the type of images. Figuring out the best settings for a project is a matter of the tests. Not all materials can be engraved. For example, wood is a good example of a material that is very versatile and may be engraved or cut. However, linoleum, another material that is used for relief printing, cannot be used because it melts too much and too fast, and also the smoke creates the residue that can be harmful for the machine. Also, I'd like to add that materials containing PVC should be avoided because they create toxic fumes. So how laser engraving can make woodblock printing more accessible? From my experience, I see several applications that include simplified image transfer, reduced matrix preparation time, reduced risks of wrist injuries, and also creative accessibility, manifested in the expansion of the type of images that can be engraved. I will talk about each of those in detail, and then I will also talk about the limitations of the technology. One of the main advantages of the technology is the reduction of the matrix preparation time. As printmakers, we all know that carving a woodblock takes quite some time. I've completed many woodcut projects, and carving a 20 by 30 inch woodblock sometimes may take several weeks of intense work. With laser engraving, an image of this size could be easily engraved in slightly over than an hour. I think it may save a lot of days of work. At the same time, if an artist prefers to modify the image or to have a more of a hand-carved feel, no one prevents them from carving on top of the image and creating like a more unique artwork. Another application that can significantly save time is use laser for image transfer. If an artist wants to still carve the image by hand, the sketch can be transferred with a very light lines, and then the carving proceeds as normal. The level of the details for image transfer may vary. It can be just a composition or a light drawing that will be carved out later by the tools. The advantage is that transferring composition or very light drawing may take less than half an hour, and it's going to you're going to save a lot of time, not only time but also material. Again, as printmakers, we all know that transferring an image on a wood block is a bit of a tedious task. Sometimes we need to use carbon paper, sometimes we need to use tracing paper, redraw image several times, or if we use an image printed with laser printer and not inkjet, then the image can be transferred with acetone, but then acetone smells and people may be sensitive to smell. So I think that's a very useful advantage of the technology. Something that also came to mind is accessibility in terms of health. When we carve an image by hand, there is a lot of repetitive movements. And this may create an injury in a wrist, which may prevent the artist from working for several weeks or even months. Using the technology, transferring the image or carving the image by laser instead of carving by hand may create opportunities for those who don't have this possibility, of people with weak wrists or who are prone to arthrosis, or just someone who doesn't want to risk their hands. And lastly, I would like to talk about creative accessibility that emerges thanks to the fact that virtually any type of an image can be engraved. Earlier, I showed my installation with images, like more photographic images that were engraved. What you see on the screen right now is an image that I engraved for my colleague at the atelier, Paul Mangui. It is a bird that she first etched, then scanned, and then we engraved it on paper, and she created this lampshade. All different types of images may be combined on one surface, and I think it creates a lot of possibilities for collage-based work, or it may serve as a more sustainable and cheaper alternative to photolithography or photo etching, just mainly due to the price. I would like to conclude my presentation by talking a little bit about the limitations of the laser engraving technology. One of the biggest challenges that I see is that it is a bit of a pricey instrument. A machine can easily cost over $40,000, and this is not something an individual artist may afford. Universities and fabrication labs have these machines. However, they may not be in close proximity to the artist, so they may be quite inaccessible. And another challenge that I see is that in order to work with the machine efficiently, an artist needs to know a graphics software such as Photoshop or Illustrator. And again, from my experience of teaching a class, a lot of people are a little bit lost when it comes to using Photoshop or Illustrator, even on a basic level. So this may require some additional investment, time investment, or taking classes or tutorials to learn graphics software. With all that being said, I think that the laser engraving can open access to more artists using woodblock printing. It may especially be interesting when used to introduce the technique to others. I think at this point, I'm going to end my very short presentation. There is much more, of course, that can be discussed or revealed. I thank you for your time and thank you so much, Brett, for inviting me to participate in the panel.
Next, we have Kat Chuddy, who is currently a student at Florida State University, completing their MFA in studio art. They received their BFA from the University of Texas at El Paso, double majoring in art history and printmaking, as well as completing a certificate in museum studies. Chuddy is the student member at large for Mid-American Print Council, the director of a podcast called DIY Access, and one of 3 people running the Uncomfortable Art Exchange, currently in its 4th year. They are currently developing an open source website to serve as a repository for unique and valuable solutions to accessibility problems in the classroom and at work. Their work has been shown all across the country, including the Atlantic Gallery in New York, as well as internationally in Japan and Spain. For their segment, Decentralizing and Decolonializing Access, It's Not About You, Kat Chuddy will be talking about the beginning of a new project called the Access Rhizome, an open online source of research, writing presentations, reading lists, and schematics for access problems that have been compiled by other artists, educators, and students. Making this information freely available gives agency back to those experiencing inequity, enabling them to not just raise awareness, but solve problems. People will be able to add to the rhizome, allowing it to continue to grow organically to meet the needs of those who use it.
I'm going to start off by introducing myself. I am Kat Chuddy. I am an FSU student in the MFA program. I am a white non-binary person. I am wearing a dark blue button-up shirt with white chevron patterns on it, and I am wearing clear glasses. So I'm going to go ahead and start with a land acknowledgement. I'm speaking to you from the ancestral and traditional homelands of the Seminole tribe of Florida, the Miccosukee tribe of Indians of Florida, the Appalachee, Seminole, and Muskogee nations, the ancient Calusa, Zeta, and Tokobanga, and others. I pay respect to the resiliency of their tribal members, past and present, and to all Indigenous peoples. Thank you for attending my talk today, and the title of it is Decentralizing, Decolonizing Access, It's Not About You. And I think a good place to start is by kind of going back in time a little bit and talking about the origin of this project. I was a participant in this past year's annual CCAC conference titled Watershed. On the screen is an image of some of the promotional material. My session was titled Making Academia Accessible. I had a very unique experience with this panel where I was kind of directly confronted with this idea that accessing other platforms might not be the best way to go to get my information out into the world where it can do the most good. So here I've got a timeline, a very truncated timeline of what happened along the way. So some people might know the conference got canceled for 2021. So initially my session proposal was approved and published. I had a really robust group of applicants and we had more than enough participants at that time. The first roadblock really, which I've got on the bottom second block there on the timeline, was that the idea of me having an undergraduate student on the panel kind of became an issue. And for me, this was a non-issue because if we're talking about access in a classroom, the lived experience of those disabled students is far more important than their positionality within the hierarchy of academia. And so while I was having a back and forth of conversation with the people that were running CCAC, and they ultimately said it was okay to have this person on the panel, I became frustrated, and out of this frustration was the birth of the podcast that I run called DIY Access. And it was it came out of this idea of wanting to create platforms for other people, and it not just being about me anymore and my ideas, and getting the ideas out into the world became more important. And so the next thing that happened there on the bottom is that the CCAC was canceled because COVID was still very much going on and disrupting things. It was rescheduled for the next year. During this dropout, some of my participants were no longer students, so they couldn't access funds to come to the panel. My pool shrunk dramatically. We lost people. And by the skin of our teeth, we still managed to present. We ended up presenting on the last day, the last session of that day, to a very small group of people. And there was a frustration in that, but the emotional impact that the information had on those people was so profound that it kept me going. A woman in the audience cried and thanked us for giving her the first real roadmap that she had ever had to kind of navigating these access issues in the classroom. And so the podcast is now on its 4th episode, but the very first episode was created solely for the purpose of giving a platform to the people that had created a very novel solution to fixing a screen printing issue. So in the upper left-hand corner is a picture of Cody Hinkle, who was a student at the University of North Florida, a wheelchair user. And Cody was in a printmaking class and was having a lot of issues accessing the table to actually do the physical motion of the screen printing. And so instead of waiting for the institution to intervene, a group was kind of organically formed between Andy's teacher, or Andrew, who was Cody's teacher, Andrew Kozlowski, and Andrew's TA was John Stowe, who's on the lower left there. And I kind of arranged this situation where I could put the 3 of them in the room together and have a conversation. And so this became a source of information where you could hear how this idea evolved, how they actually solved the problem, which was virtually no cost. They kind of salvaged some materials and propped up the table in a way that made printing possible. And so this one went really well, and I've kept going on to things like art shows, but this brought me back to a larger question. Again, if this isn't about me, what is my larger picture in the world? And so the image on the screen here is of a web I've mapped out of some of the connections and the places that I've been, and how these things are starting to kind of link together and form their own organism. And I started considering the idea of building culture and creating platforms as a practice. And this is a zoom in of the kind of small subsection that I'm talking about in this talk, which was the large left node here is CCAC, and then on the right next to it is the DIY Access podcast, and then right above it in the middle is something called the Access Rhizome, which is what I've been leading up to at this point. So I have created an open source repository of information that functions as a website called the Access Rhizome. I was inspired by the idea that all these connections and things kind of happened naturally on their own, and wanted to emphasize that with this idea of a rhizome, because this is how this root structure kind of grows sideways through soil and connects to other plants. So this is the splash page. It's not anything fancy to look at right now, and it's just barely starting at this point. And I'm giving pages to individuals that do research, people that have presented with me on panels. People can volunteer their information. So I've got 2 of my presenters here, Sarah Foll and Bert Stabler. And I already have a secondary connection through Bert Stabler to Timothy Smith. And there is a ton of information linked on the page through Timothy Smith. There's also something called the Zombie Survival Guide, which I'm sure some people remember from teaching during the pandemic, and that is also still open and has been linked on this page. And so these ideas have also kind of grown far beyond the idea of just looking at disability issues in the classroom, but looking at any kind of educational access problems. There's also a repository underneath the main repository here for the podcast, and there are full transcripts that are searchable and readable with a screen reader. This is an example of one of the pages that we have for one of the contributors that was on the page. So he presented on the CCAC panel, so there's the CCAC presentation there, but Bert also runs a blog and does writing, and there's also his website as well. So I'd just like to thank everyone for listening and kind of giving this project a platform while it's in its initial nascent stages. And please share this information and contact us if you would like to be a part of this project. I'm looking for people to help me kind of manage the repository. I'm looking for people to add information to the repository. So if you have anything that deals with any kind of access issues, whether that's disabilities or ESOL learners, financial access, housing and food insecurities for students, and any kind of resources that you have that can help other teachers as they distribute these kinds of things to their students and seek to change their classrooms. Thank you.
Our last but not least panelist is Ross Mazupapa, is the Associate Teaching Professor of Printmaking and Photography at Bowling Green State University in Bowling Green, Ohio. Beyond his interdisciplinary art practice, Ross has worked for the past several years to develop new processes and tools for printmaking and photography. His best known development has been an inexpensive and simple procedure to make rollers and brayer. His goal with this process is to teach and share with others how to make their own quality rollers and brayers to overcome the financial investment outside of funded institutions. He is working to make printmaking a more fiscally available practice for everyone.
Hi, I'm Ross Mazupapa, and I'm the Associate Teaching Professor of Printmaking and Photography at Bowling Green State University. For my portion of today's panel, I'd like to talk about how I'm expanding access to printmaking tools and creating a more inclusive printmaking environment. The way I'm doing that is several years ago, I developed a very simple process to make and cast our own DIY rollers and brayers. This project you can easily scale up to a roller like this, or even scale down to small hand brayers for those who are more limited in their dexterity. I'd like to do a quick overview of the process with you folks today, just to show you how quick and accessible this process is for everyone. I'm utilizing as many materials from local hardware stores that you folks may have close to you, as well as any mold making materials from an internationally shipping company that can be found worldwide. So as I mentioned, doing a little bit of other research, I came across the Smooth On Company, which produces lots of different mold making materials for a wide breadth of industries. And I found that they have this Rio Flex castable urethane rubber. Other things I'm also getting from the Smooth On Company is I'm getting some UV protected pigments for pigmenting my rollers, and also some mold release too. So once I sort of found my material I wanted to work in, the question was, how do I make a mold, and how can I make a mold easily that I can access and have different sizes? And what I came to was using PVC pipe from the hardware store. What's nice about PVC pipe is that it's extruded, so it has a nice seamless inside and outside. They also come in lots of different sizes too, and lengths, which is great. So my whole project is kind of based around using PVC pipe as our mold making materials. For holding our mold together, you can use these PVC pipe caps that you can also buy in the same section at your hardware store, but they become a little bit cost prohibitive. So I am lucky enough to have a laser cutter, so I am making some laser cut parts that get glued together to make a mold base that acts in the same manner as this. So I'm going to start by attaching my 1-inch diameter PVC pipe to my mold base. And I have laser engraved some guides here to help me find that perfect center. I then apply a little mold release. Now I slip the 2-inch PVC pipe over, and I make sure to align both pipes so that they are nice and even to each other. Now I'll just tack a little hot glue around the outside edge. As an extra precaution, I've added a little bit of electrical tape just to hold that in place too. Again, making sure that everything stays nice and even. So now that my mold is complete, I've measured out equal parts A and B by volume in just mixing containers. For this demo today, I'm going to be using the RioFlex 30 as sort of the standard sort of print roller to use. So when you add colorant, you add that to part B, and then you mix that in, you mix A, then into B, and then after you mix these two together, you have about 20 minutes to then pour them into your mold. When combining parts A and B together, make sure to scrape the sides and scrape the bottom to make sure that they are thoroughly and completely mixed together. I usually spend about anywhere from 3 to 5 minutes making sure that my rubber is cohesively combined. All right, now that that's done, I'm going to pour it into my mold. There should be no streaks or anything in your rubber. It should be completely one coherent, consistent, very gooey sort of mix. If there's any air bubbles in my rubber, I'm going to do a technique called needling, which means I'm going to let a very thin stream of my rubber pour out, and that'll pull any air bubbles out as I cast my mold. All right, there we are. Now I set this aside and I let this rest for 16 hours or overnight. So after 16 hours has set, you can undo that tape. You can then scrape off with a putty knife any glue on the outside, and you can pull apart your mold. All right. So as this is, I then use another piece of 1-inch PVC pipe, and I have glued some laser cut little caps on here. Again, you can just easily do this in the wood shop with some other less technical skills. And that should fit in to our roller. All right. And then again, I'm using a 1/4-inch threaded zinc rod as my connection point. And that's just held on with 2 end nuts. And there we go. We have our completed 6-inch width by 2-inch diameter brayer. If you folks are interested in making this, I'm going to have my mold base as well as the parts for free to download from a QR code I'm going to put on screen, as well as I'm going to give that link hopefully for the description as well for this video. So hopefully that gives you folks a sense of how easy and simple this process is. I really wanted to design it so that anyone, or most anyone, can go about the process and make their own roller or brayer. Again, you can scale this up or scale this down. So some of the impact from this, again, I've been doing this project since late 2018, early 2019. And it's just been really quite a roller coaster and such a great time. I've been able to do workshops in Philadelphia, in Fresno, California, at Ohio University. I've also been able to do online demonstrations at Mid-America Print Council, now here SGCI, as well as in Print Austin. And the feedback has just been amazing from people out there. People from around the world as well as across this country post and ask me questions and share the rollers and the brayers that they've made. Initially, I did make this project for people outside of academia, but realizing the economic struggles that we're facing in our dwindling School of Art programs across the country, it's been awesome to see less funded programs, print programs, being able to make their own rollers and brayers, to have the tools for the students and show the students that they too can make their own tools so that they can continue making the art that they want to have. This has been very rewarding. There's still so much more research I have to do in this and push this even further, but it's been great to lower that financial burden for young artists or established artists or people from different socioeconomic backgrounds to have their own tools to make the artwork that they want to make. This has been such a great and wonderful community. And I just look forward to continuing this project further, doing more online workshops, doing more in-person workshops, and just getting brayers and rollers into the hands of people who want them and need them, and getting more artwork out into the world is overall my end goal for this project. If you'd like to know more about me or want to follow along, please feel free to contact me at my provided email, or check me out on Instagram at @rossmazapapa. And thank you so much for your time today. Thank you so much for putting together and accepting this panel of wonderful artists and educators and community members. This topic of accessibility in printmaking is one really dear to my heart. And I know I'm only addressing it here in the economic standards, but there are just so many more conversations that we can and should be having as far as this is concerned. Again, my name is Ross Mazapapa, and thank you so much for your time today.
I would like to take this time to thank you for attending our panel on access and accessibility in printmaking. I encourage you to reach out to panelists with questions, to continue the conversation using the listed information, and to see the chat for links and additional resources. Thank you for your time and enjoy the conference.